Good evening and welcome to First Talk with Violet Gonda. Tonight we continue with the unfolding events in Zimbabwe, talking about the new cabinet that was announced by President Robert Mugabe this week. To help me discuss this topic is Rashweat Mukundu, a political analyst in Zimbabwe. And we have Reason Wafawarova, a political writer who joins us on Skype in Australia. And in the studio, we have a professor of political science, Professor Richard Saunders, who is who teaches at York University in Canada, and he has written extensively on Zimbabwe in the last few years. Welcome on the program, gentlemen.
Thank you, Violet.
Let me start with Rashweat. You're in Zimbabwe there. First of all, can you give us your reaction to this new cabinet? What did you make of it?
Well, Violet, it's a cabinet that reflects President Robert Mugabe's wish for political stability in Zimbabwe. It is a cabinet that is more focused on ensuring the continuity or the continued role of ZANU-PF. More interestingly, it is a cabinet that is politically safe for President Robert Mugabe and ZANU-PF, and also maybe looking at the taxation issues with ZANU-PF. There are no surprises. I think it's the same old theme that we have known in the past with a few new faces, but essentially it's not a reform-oriented cabinet. It is a cabinet that will likely do business as usual, and more importantly, I think, manage the internal politics in ZANU-PF, especially so as this is President Mugabe's likely last term in office.
Reason, what do you think? Is this not a reform-oriented cabinet?
In terms of the composition, first of all, we have seen a positive improvement in terms of the size of the cabinet. We know the compromises that got us 33 cabinet posts in the last ministry down to 26. We have 3 ministers of state, I think, down from 9, and we still have the governors through the back door, if you want, 10 ministers. Now, coming to your question, we can look at it in 2 ways. If you look at the ZANU-PF manifesto and how these people have started, we have just heard what Nicholas Goche was saying in terms of the public service. There seems to be still a willingness to pursue what ZANU-PF was preaching during the elections. So from that perspective, you could talk of an element of reform. In terms of personalities, it is a mixture. There would be an understandable feeling by some to say if somebody has been there for over a decade or 2 decades, and it's hard to imagine that there can be a proponent of reform. People would tend to think that whatever they did over that period of time is likely to be what they will do. So that would be understandable. But I think what you really want to look at is more the push. ZANU-PF is not the ZANU-PF of 1996 or 1990. There is a lot of other pressures coming now that would force a more determined focus on policy, if you want. So when you look
we'll talk more about that issue, especially to do with the policy. But let me just go to Professor Richard Saunders and ask, what do you see as the most significant thing that has happened in this new cabinet?
Well, Violet, while I agree that this is a stand-firm cabinet, there's no surprises in terms of new players. There are 2 surprises in terms of the prominence of 2 particular ministries. One, indigenization, and secondly, mines. In the first instance of indigenization, as we know, was the centerpiece of the ZANU campaign in the last election, but it's also been a wedge policy issue over the last 2.5 years with the MDC. It's a thing that has redefined ZANU in terms of a modern set of economic policies. And it was also a ministry which was very much under the control of a minister, often in very unilateral terms. So the departure of that minister, Xavier Casqueri, I think is quite significant. And the bringing in of a minister who is widely perceived to have less clout and to be a more passive kind of minister might be a tip of the hat in terms of backing off from some of the more aggressive language that was used during the campaign before around indigenization. The second case of Mines is very significant because Mines, as we know, is by far the leader in terms of contributions to the economy. It's more than 20% of the gross domestic product now is provided by mining, and the bulk of Zimbabwe's crucial foreign exchange earnings. And to have a controversial and very powerful minister like Oberton Pofer removed says a lot. Again, that seems to be the tip, ZANU's tip, to say that they're willing to compromise on important mines and important indigenization issues and maybe look for a slightly softer road. We'll have to see, but the removal of those two very powerful ministers seems to indicate something.
Do you agree, Rashweat, with what Richard Suanders has just said in terms of the two most important ministries, the Mines Ministry and the Indigenization, and that the removal of Xavier Kasukuwere, who is seen as a more aggressive character, is significant? Do you agree with that, and that ZANU-PF may be trying to turn down on the issue of indigenization?
Yes, I certainly agree with that analysis. The indigenization question is quite problematic for ZANU-PF in that our economy is really struggling to pick up. We have as many industries still closing down and very little investment coming in, especially from outside. So if you are ready to pursue indigenization to its letter as per the policy, then you might as well call indigenization a deindustrialization policy. As the main of its tenants, I think, will result in concern by investors in coming into putting money into Zimbabwe. So by putting in a person like Nema, President Mugabe is, I think, trying to slow down the process, but in some respects, maybe just to quieten the whole question of indigenization. It will still be talked about. It will still be talked about at a policy level. There will still be, I think, a pursuit of the big mining companies, but I don't think that it will be as widespread as we have been told. My thinking is that the banking sector will likely have a much watered down indigenization formula from ZANU-PF. And in regards to the mining sector, to the appointment of Walter Chidakwa, let us not forget that Walter Chidakwa is a close relative of President Mugabe. The Chidakwas and the Mugabes and the Makidiris are the same family. So my take is that the diamond and mining sector has firmly been put in the hands of the Mugabe family, or it's now a family affair. And Walter Chidakwa is not well established politically in ZANU-PF. He has no political clout to oppose Mugabe's wishes or policies. And to me, I think it's a genuine indication of the president playing it safe, wanting to control a key lever of the economy by appointing someone whom he can give instructions without any problem.
Reason, do you agree with this, especially as some observers are saying that Xavier Kasukuwere hadn't actually done anything in terms of the indigenization policies, and that he had merely made threats? So why would it be a demotion if he had not really done much? Do you think, do you agree with what the other panelists are saying about this issue?
I think Minister Kasukuwere did quite significant work in terms of the drive towards indigenization. The community schemes that he did were quite significant. The work that he did with the Attorney General's office in terms of legislation towards the indigenization program was quite intensive. Yes, much of the work that he did could have been overshadowed by the rhetoric and some of the things that were happening in the public. I do agree with both Professor Suanders and Rashweat. I will start with Professor Suanders. Yes, there is an element of a shift in terms of where to go. Just like land reform program, we came to a point where there was a need to have a shift towards supporting resettled farmers and to tone down on the rhetoric that was characteristic of the land acquisition itself. And I think we are coming to a point where the focus could be on now shaping the way forward. And I do agree with Rashweat in the sense that some problematic sectors where it was felt, at least in the public domain, we saw there was not agreement in terms of the service industry, particularly the banks. So those areas where even within ZANU-PF we seem to have discord, I think this is time to iron out and to save some faces. People had public wars and so on. So it could have just been a strategic move because the people that disagreed with Minister Kasukuwere are still powerful in government, and some of the disagreements were quite in the public domain, as we all know. So in terms of shaping up the way forward, you would want somebody who is more acceptable to not only the outside world, but also to the parties that were not really in agreement, even within ZANU-PF itself. So it could have been part of that. I think the issue of consultation, especially on the banking sector, was quite prominently debated, that Minister Kasukuwere was kind of overstepping his mark in the financial sector without necessarily consulting the authorities there. So that probably could have influenced some of the decisions taken. But while saying that, I would want to say the indigenization as it is in terms of its leaning towards natural resources is unlikely to be diluted. We are seeing even the talk from the president now, especially towards the mining sector. I think the drive will still be the same. Even Minister Nema could have specific instructions to focus towards mining and towards industry that is related to natural resources, in fact, or the extraction industry. There could be a lot of toning down in the service industry,
Okay.
IT, and banking sector. That's how I see it. And coming to Walter Chidakwa, he was a deputy minister to two ministers, first Minister Nkomo and then to Gordon Moyo at the state enterprises. So that is the ZANU-PF tradition. They normally want to get people coming through the deputy minister, just like Xavier Kasukuwere himself. And when you look at Minister Mpofu, who became powerful, like the professor said, he came from the junior ranks of ZANU-PF as well, starting off as a governor and so on. But when he got the Ministry of Mines, he just made a name. And the same as Kasukuwere, I know Deputy Minister Matongo is not, the information one who was quite vocal, is not in this lineup. But we have seen a lot of young people coming from those ranks, or people that are just coming from the junior ranks of ZANU-PF, making an impact. And this could probably be the belief that Walter as well might just be another Mpofu.
Okay, we'll come back to that reason. Richard?
2 points. One on Xavier Kasukuwere and indigenization, second on Walter Chidakwa. Kasukuwere has been very effective in getting indigenization out as a wedge issue, as becoming a major distinguishing platform for ZANU. But when one looks at the nuts and bolts of how indigenization's played out, especially in the mining sector, the very crucial mining sector, the promise is less delivered than one might expect. If one looks, for example, at community share ownership schemes and employee share ownership schemes, there's been a lot of talk about delivery, but if you actually go around to the more than 50 schemes that were launched in the last 2 years, there's a great lack of information on how much money has actually been put in and is accessible and is being spent. And furthermore, those who have led community development organizations in the past, in Chiadzwa, for example, say that no money has come to them and they've not been included in the management or participation in deciding where money should be spent. We see the same thing, by the way, at another location for redistribution, that's around Zimplats in Chigudu Mondoro, where there's been apparently rival schemes set up by rival local politicians and securocrats. And again, a lot of fogginess around what actually has been delivered now and in the future in terms of equity shares that are coming to those community organizations. And more broadly about indigenization, I think we also need to raise a question about Xavier Kasagwiri and the organizations he set up under his ministry, the National Indigenization Economic Empowerment Fund and Board, who still have not told us how much money they have to buy shares or how many shares have actually been redistributed to the state via these holding or warehousing companies, and haven't told us, in effect, how many companies have fully complied in terms of not only submitting an approved indigenization plan, but also acting on that plan. As you may know, the law actually says, the law under which Kasagwiri has worked, and said that one needs to submit a plan that's acceptable, but it does not specify penalties if one doesn't do it. There are no penalties in the law as it stands. That's the first set of issues around indigenization and where Minister Kasagwiri was effective and where he was not in actually implementing indigenization. The second issue is around Walter Chidakwa and his previous role at ZMDC, the Zimbabwe Mining Development Corporation. As you may recall, the Portfolio Committee on Mines and Energy, which released a 4-year study, its report, an official parliamentary report, in June of this year, roundly condemned ZMDC, said that ZMDC was operating outside rules, normal rules and procedures in the law, that it had been involved in shady deals with some of the diamond miners in Chiadzwa, that it had become a junior partner to some companies, did not have a management role at all in the most important of the diamond miners, Mbada, and that in some cases it had participated in either blocking information or misleading Parliament. And this was an extraordinary report by the Portfolio Committee headed by the late Chindori Chininga. And it's one that I think we need to look carefully at when we consider the record of Minister Chidakwa.
So these are the people who have been appointed or promoted to these positions.
Yes.
Do we see any organizations in Zimbabwe trying to push in terms of trying to expose some of these things so that they don't go away, even though some of these people have been made ministers?
Yes, I think, again, we come back to indigenization, which was the main policy plank of this election campaign for ZANU. And despite the fact that it's a bit of a messy piece of legislation and statutes that has been irregularly instituted and hazily instituted and implemented in some cases, we need to nonetheless recognize that indigenization has fundamentally changed the way in which key stakeholders in Zimbabwe now relate. It is no longer possible for Zimbabwean business, either foreign or local, to avoid the issue of economic sovereignty. It's no longer possible for donors, as Zimbabwe approaches the Paris Club, to start working again with them, to avoid the issue of indigenization and local control and the sometimes very often negative role of foreign investors in Zimbabwe in the post-independence period. And particularly from my perspective, the question of indigenization and the rights that it implies for local communities and poorer Zimbabweans is extremely important for civil society. It has opened the door for civil society to rejoin the debate about the economic future of Zimbabwe, a door that was shut 12, 15 years ago and remained shut for much of the 2000s in the period of political contestation. That door is now open. If we look in the mining sector, for example, we see this week in Harare, the alternative civil society-led mining indaba was held with wide participation, not just from Chamber of Mines and NGOs who are active in monitoring mining, but community groups, traditional leaders, residents associations, a range of people trying to imagine what indigenization can mean in a better sense, i.e. not a policy for predation, but a policy for progress and inclusion and participation. And despite what anyone might think about indigenization from the left or the right or the middle, I think this is a very positive development, that the door has been opened for a new kind of conversation and about the future of Zimbabwe. And if ZANU can enable and facilitate that discussion and participate more openly in it, I think this is a positive step forward potentially.
Rashweat, What relationship do you think this new government is going to have with Western countries? Because many people are saying that, time has come for the government to actually engage with the Western countries because we're going to have this government for the next 5 years. So, what sort of relationship do you think they're going to have?
Well, my thinking is that the current dispute and emotions over the election results will dissipate soon, and the reality will sink in within both camps, that is the Western world, as well as within ZANU-PF and the government of President Robert Mugabe. It could be that there will be a discussion on setting new terms of engagement. In the past, we've seen that the EU and the America, Australia, New Zealand were using the global political agreement and the performance of the government of national unity, as well as the conduct of a free and fair election, as a benchmark to engage ZANU-PF and President Robert Mugabe. Now that is over, the GPA is over, the GNU is over, the elections are done. How else, what benchmarks are we going to see coming to facilitate an engagement between the two parties? Whilst there appear to be a huge differences or a chasm between the two, my sense is that the EU and the US will still find ways to engage the new government. More so because the Africa SADC are firmly behind the new government in Zimbabwe. But it appears that while taking a hardline position, President Robert Mugabe, Minister Shinamasa are already sending some signals that they would still want to engage. I remember President Mugabe in his inauguration speech, as well as subsequent press conferences, talking of how Zimbabwe needs to have a friendly relationship with those that wish it well. And Minister Shinamasa has equally stated the same position. So my thinking is that we will see a realignment or a shift in terms of what the issues are. It could be that there will be the EU and the Western world will be the rest of the Western world will be concerned on how the indigenization policy will be implemented. Will also be concerned on how the new constitution will be implemented, as well as how the new government will handle issues of human rights. So this could be, I think, the new benchmark that will be used to facilitate engagement. But the fact that these countries have maintained contact with Zimbabwe, just last week the EU was writing letters to talk to some ministers in or some departments in the government, of course, which were then seen as untoward. But to me, that indicates that the EU especially is working on engaging President Mugabe's government.
So, Rashweat, so you're saying that ZANU-PF could use this period to rebrand itself, even though the MDC says that the cabinet is packed with dead wood and recycled people?
Well, the position taken by the MDC is entirely an MDC position. I might share it, I may not share it, but it's not going to influence how the Western world will engage with PF. MDC, I'm sure, has its own problems right now, and its capacity to influence the decisions either of the new government or the EU and the rest of the Western world seem to be diminishing. So my take is that using a new set of issues, the EU and ZANU-PF might still have to find each other. ZANU-PF has gained its legitimacy to some extent with the African Union as well as with SADC. It still has challenges with the Western world, and that's what I'm sure they will be working on. And it could be that they will use indigenization to be a watered-down indigenization policy to reach out to the Western world. They will also try to minimize as much as possible problems around on the human rights front, because that is in an area of confrontation with the Western world. So we are unlikely, I think, to see as much of an open human rights violation from the ZANU-PF government. So the rebranding of ZANU-PF is continuing, and my take is that it's a matter of time before the EU and the America, the USA, and the rest of the Western world re-engage ZANU-PF. But what that form will take, no one can tell right now.
The reason, which policy direction do you think ZANU-PF is going to take?
Yes, I think from now onwards we have to reflect. ZANU-PF has been calling for the lifting of sanctions, targeted or not, whatever qualitative terms we may use before them, but there is sanctions against Zimbabwe, and they have been calling for the lifting of those sanctions. And that just means a willingness to continue with trading partners that are traditional to the country, to the tradition of the country's economy. That is preference number one. We still have the Look East policy. Minister Chinamasa, just after swearing in, he mentioned that we would push towards willing partners, mainly from the East. And I do think that that kind of thinking, that line of thinking is going to be used by ZANU-PF and has been used before as a leverage to try and disempower the effect of the isolation from the Western community. But I think preference number one is to realign the economy to what it has traditionally been in terms of the trading partners from the EU and from the Western community. So I do agree that from where we are now, ZANU-PF is not going to be confrontational. For starters, I mean, look, the real political threat that contributes much to the to the abrasive rhetoric that we normally hear is it's a strong MDC, and as things stand now, if you are going to go by the numbers, if you are going to go by the structure of the current parliament, the MDC is probably at its lowest. So that alone, it will take away a significant amount of will in terms of going towards abrasive rhetoric. So what you're going to see, in my opinion, is a shift towards, if you want, moderation, where it can be accommodated to try and accommodate the Western world. But I think the most important thing that's going to happen is the China influence in Africa. Not only that, BRICS and everything. It's not isolation now. It's not a leverage anymore. There is so many economic powerhouses that would just cooperate with the isolated countries. So I think the Westerners do realize that as well. And like Professor Suanders just said, yes, there might have been all this opposition to the indigenization policy, but the reality of it is, in principle, it sounds good to many people, including people in the West. It's just like the land reform. Nobody dares challenge the principle. People would rather concentrate on how it was done, but you are not going to say people should not own their resources. So when you look at it, people are going to sober up and see that this is a policy that we are probably going to live with, and the best thing is to realize that times have changed. Going to Africa to provide employment and making money is no longer the years. Now you got to work with the people and see how you make profit under the prevailing circumstances. So I think there will be an adjustment on both sides. ZANU-PF will try to, and I mean, it's very strategic when you look at Minister Chinamasa. He has been actively, together with Tendai Biti, going to the Western community to try and establish some form of re-engagement. And as far as ZANU-PF is concerned, they see him as a continuity when he is holding that finance portfolio. And he has been to London, he has been to America, he has been to the major Western capitals with the same message. And he's going back as a finance minister now. Is probably the best strategy for ZANU-PF.
Let me ask Richard Suanders about that, especially the relationship between ZANU-PF and the Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. What's going to happen there?
Well, I agree with much of what Rashweat and Reason have said, and they've really hit the nail on the head in saying that now is the time for compromise. ZANU-PF has a little bit of breathing room now, in the sense that they don't need to share power with anyone. And they don't need to wedge themselves differently from the MDC in terms of policy. So they have a bit of breathing room. They also have a problem that won't go away, and that there is a large constituency in Zimbabwe, according to past votes we've seen, and if one has a more sober look at the current electoral outcome, there's a large constituency which is not in favor of more of the same. They want a different path. So ZANU needs to play a middle road between what they had campaigned around and something that approached more what they were, where they were in the 1990s, which is also a problematic space. It's a space, a kind of policy which links them to the World Bank and international financial institutions, which led to a cutback in social programs and austerity, which led to deindustrialization, which led to a lot of debt repayment rather than social expenditure. And that's the other face of policy they're looking at right now. And compromise means compromising a bit with an old model which led to political problems and legitimacy problems for ZANU in the first place.
Are you saying structural adjustment programs like
structural adjustment, and what we haven't talked about is the June 2013 letter of intent signed by government as the election campaign was underway for an IMF staff monitoring program, a 5-year staff monitoring program. If you look at the guts of that program, it calls for a return to austerity with very close monitoring by the IMF and a firm statement from the IMF and the donors allied to them that there will be no debt forgiveness in Zimbabwe for 5 years unless this program is held to. Now that's important in the context of something else Rashweat and Reason mentioned, that's the role of China and funding. At the moment, Zimbabwe's foreign debt is more than 10 billion, and 77% of that debt is now arrears, i.e. interest payments on capital that wasn't paid, and it's accumulating very quickly. China is not going to bail Zimbabwe out of that debt overhang, which is very significant. And Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwe government, by using minerals and few other parts of the economy which are actually growing and produce forex, are not going to tax their way out of this either. Zimbabwe is actually in an unusual situation of having relatively low fiscal space. That means there is very little space left to tax and exact more revenue into government. Zimbabwe's rate of revenue through fiscal taxation into the fiscus is about 32%. The average for SADC, I think, is around 11 or 12. In other words, they're very efficient at taxing, and they've kind of reached the limit of what can be obtained unless laws are changed significantly from local production. So there's a problem with debt.
What can they do exactly? Because if we're to go with what you're saying on the issue of the structural adjustment programs, how can they do this at the same time with indigenization? Isn't that a contradiction?
This is a glaring contradiction, and this is the difficulty of policy mediation, and I think this is why it's taken, almost 6 weeks for a cabinet to be formed. Who are the people you can put in place in particular positions who can mediate this very difficult path between some form of indigenization that cannot be completely abandoned, and I don't think most Zimbabweans want to see it abandoned, and a return to favor with the Paris Club, with the IMF and others, which will require some kinds of shift in direction in terms of broader economic policy. And that's what's taken so long to put this cabinet in place, I think, amongst other things.
Rashweat, what can you say about that, especially this idea of, going back to the ESAP kind of model? Doesn't that hurt the workers? And isn't that a bad way of starting, things in Zimbabwe?
Well, I don't see ZANU-PF essentially going back to the ESAP model as influenced by the Bretton Woods institutions' thinking or models. The Zimbabwean economy has transformed in a number of ways, especially from 2000. And much of our industry is not only destroyed, but we are now more consumer economy, buying goods from South Africa and the rest of the world. Aspects of our economy where there's need for support
Hello.
affecting agriculture. And in that potential, I think, to revive the agro industry. And our social services are already at their law. And if you are to apply an ASAP model, it means that you are asking the government to stop supporting the education sector, stop supporting the health sector, which are run contrary to the core of the ZANU-PF manifesto, which talks of direct intervention, state interventions to prop up the social services, as well as direct interventions in directing economic policy, that is through the indigenization of mines, as well as support for agriculture. So our economy, I think, is no longer in a position to apply an ESAP kind of model. And let me say that the political dynamics have also changed, as Reason was saying. The ZANU-PF government will likely focus on assistance from China. But let me add that even as the Chinese will come in to work with the ZANU-PF government, they are also interested in stability. They are not interested in investing their money and working with a government in which there is a policy discordancy, and also where there are challenges in terms of policy consistency. So to me, there is, I think, a room, especially if the international community, if the European Union, if the Americans can coordinate their efforts with the Chinese as well as with SADC to help the ZANU-PF government take the positive reforms on the economy, as well as positive reforms around the governance. Because almost all the powers that have an interest in Zimbabwe, be they Western countries or the Eastern powers, they also want to be working in a stable environment. And the Chinese Communist Party, I think, he said pretty much the same sometime early this year or late last year, when they were in talks with ZANU-PF on assisting them on their election programming, that they need to learn from China, where despite all our concerns on the human rights issues in China, the political setup, there is a predictable leadership transition. The investment policies are clear. So even the pressure is also coming from that end, that the ZANU-PF must reform and be consistent in its economic policies, and be consistent in terms of maintaining order and come and ensure that their governance.
Yeah, but Rashweat, let me ask Reason the same question, because both of you seem to say that China can come to Zimbabwe's rescue. But isn't there just so much that China can do, and that ZANU-PF does need to work with Western countries, and especially get assistance from, the IMF or the World Bank? And if so, does this not mean that they will be forced to actually accept some of these structural adjustment programs? Reason?
I think, like most African politicians, we have seen a very sad situation where more focus from the West is towards the donor community. And what we have been taught and what we have gone through at independence with our education system and all the social services that Rashweat was talking about is that we focus on getting donations from the West, and I think ZANU-PF is no exception. Most people, when they talk of engaging the West, they are thinking of having lots of donations coming, and we have seen that with Malawi. So much emphasis, more than capital investment, people are just thinking of Western governments pouring money in terms of grants and donations, which is a very sad reality for Africa in general. But I think what Professor Suanders was saying is you get this situation where Zimbabwe came from at the end of the Cold War, and they talked of scientific socialism, and there was a bit of a dilemma there in the early 90s, and then the IMF came in with ESAP, and we saw all the austerity measures that were introduced. And that takes us to what Rashweat was saying. That came with what caused the MDC. Changirai came to prominence because he was opposing ESAP, the Structural Adjustment Program. That's how he came to prominence. And the ZCTU was quite opposed to the harsh realities that faced the worker during those days. Now, that economy, obviously, the failure of ESAP, in terms of what it led the country into, yes, led to what we saw from 2000 with the establishment of the MDC. But we have an economy now that is more informal, like it's based on the informal sector. And I think what ZANU-PF is hoping on is now the small businesses that are in Zimbabwe are largely indigenously owned, and the indigenization policy has been set. And when you look at what Professor Suanders was talking about, the employment ownership schemes, community ownership schemes, NAIB, all those things that Kasukuwere set up, there might be a lot of irregularities as he cited. But I think for ZANU-PF, when they look at that, the structure has been set and it's there. Now what they want is somebody that can come with some kind of perfection to the employment ownership scheme, community ownership scheme, to NAIB. And if somebody is going to come into Zimbabwe, they want somebody who is going to come and strengthen the small businesses that are largely owned by indigenous people. And the mentality of going to school and getting a nice job has significantly diminished in Zimbabwe after the economic hardships. A lot of young people you see today, they want to start their own little thing and make their own money. And I think ZANU-PF reads that mentality very well. So when IMF is going to come in with their 5-year plan, they are not coming in to see a Zimbabwe of 1992 that was all focused on employment and, go to university, get a job. They are coming to a Zimbabwe where people are looking at these minerals as a source of livelihood, and they want to start a small mine, they want to start this. I talk to people from Zimbabwe every day. People want to know who can buy this, who can buy this. The mentality is totally changed from where can I get a job. Okay. So they are coming to a country that is totally transformed, as Rashweat was saying. So I think those factors are going to play a role in what we are going to see in the next way. But there is some kind of middle-of-the-road approach that the professor was talking about, where ZANU-PF will have to turn down on its rhetoric while it focuses on support from China. For goodness sake, we have seen, China has done a lot in terms of grants and loans and just coming in as partners. So we cannot ignore that side of things. Okay. But like I say, for the farmer, for the tobacco farmer, we still have the West as our traditional partners. People want to restore those kind of relations.
Richard?
I agree with both Reason and Rashweat, and I didn't mean to suggest that the Zimbabwe of today is the same as the 1990s. I guess my point was that ZANU has been floating a number of policy options around, including signing a letter of agreement with the IMF. It doesn't mean they're going to go forward with it, but it's a signal. They're setting off little fires to see who rushes to take interest, watch them, and put them out. I think that's, and to agree with Reason on this last point, I think this is the strategy, is to see what's an acceptable face of austerity. It's not about industrialization, using the market like ESAP was, but the focus now is on the debt. And it's not just this recent letter of agreement with the IMF, which may or may not go forward. Last year we saw the Zimbabwe Accelerated Debt Initiative and a program associated with it, which was an official program of government. And that's very much focused on using traditional spend down of debt as a government priority, leveraged with mineral resources. So a reallocation of mineral resources, not towards social development, but towards spending down the debt. And that also clearly was a signal to the Paris Club and other international donors that there would be a shift of position, or at least leeway for doing business in a different way in Zimbabwe. I guess that was the crux of the point I was trying to make. Okay. Whether one can pull this off or not, who gets left behind when one moderates on indigenization? What expectations get dashed following this recent election campaign with pulling back on immediate indigenization? Some have suggested that within the mineral sector, at the discretion of the minister, within with the Minister of Indigenization, that the percentages can be rolled back. that it was a general notice which introduced the special conditions for mining and the time frame, but these can also be changed. So it will be interesting to see what effective, concrete steps are taken in the near future. On the question of China, I think the jury is still out on the impact, the longer-term impact of Chinese engagement in many countries, including Angola, in terms of what Chinese investment has been directed at, whether it's been energy and minerals-based or wider, the social development benefits, and what have you. But there seems to be one key point of agreement by many academics and researchers involved in this debate about China and Africa, and that is that China also wants a stable economy and that it's quite comfortable with a neoliberal approach to economics. It might talk social development and South-South cooperation, but it also is happy with neoliberalism. And the IMF is looking to consolidate neoliberalism in Zimbabwe.
Very interesting. Now, I'm running out of time, but I just want to hear your thoughts briefly about the MDC and how it can work within this new structure. We do have an opposition that is extremely traumatized right now. So how can they move on, Richard?
I suppose with every opposition, the beginning point is Parliament, which is a legitimate institution for national debate, for research, and contribution to policy making. If civil society organizations, those which ZANU-PF had also seen as oppositional, can use portfolio committees and other instruments of Parliament to make constructive interventions in policy making, then perhaps the MDC might consider that as well. It's a strategic choice. But if it turns out that this election and the results of this election are stuck in here to stay, then the MDC has some hard choices about where to make an alternative, positive, constructive voice heard in Zimbabwe, both inside Parliament and outside Parliament. I think there's lots of space for that. And it's a strategic choice as to where you want to make your voice loudest heard.
And Rashweat, what do you think the MDC needs to do now?
Well, the MDC needs to accept the defeat, and I say so not necessarily to say that the election was entirely free and fair and credible, but if they do accept the defeat, then it allows them to self-introspect. It was the responsibility of the MDC to ensure that the environment was conducive for an election and that they would win. It was not the responsibility of ZANU-PF to create an environment in which they would lose power. So the MDC needs to accept that reality and go back to the people, mobilize, and counter ZANU-PF at every turn in terms of how ZANU-PF will implement its policies in the next 5 years. The MDC must find and reconnect with its political base, and from there convince the citizens of Zimbabwe to ensure that they win the 2018 election.
Reason, the MDC has accused ZANU-PF of rigging elections in 2000, 2002, 2005, 2008, and now 2013. Will they ever win an election against ZANU-PF?
Yes, there is a possibility that the MDC can one day win an election, but they do need to transform. Just like ZANU-PF, we have been talking of shifting in policy, shifting in rhetoric, and all sorts of reforms and transformations and moderations. The MDC, like most of the opposition parties in Africa, they tend to become polarized losers. We see that after almost 90% of our elections in Africa, that when people lose, they just do not want to lose with their magnanimity. They just don't want to accept. And the second point is that the MDC started as a movement. And just like the liberation movement, ZANU-PF was towards getting independence. They started as a movement with so many interests coming together. It is high time the MDC moves from protest politics of a movement organization into a proper political party. They clearly struggle with policy matters. They could not even articulate their own juice, their own plan. They are more vocal and more vociferous and more powerful when they're just protesting against what other people are doing. That is what they call politics. When you go to their rally, it's all about that. And I think for the MDC now people are are fed up with that, to be honest. They don't want to see that anymore. It was popular in 2000. If the MDC had managed to do just this little bit more in 2000, they probably could have toppled ZANU-PF and then transformed into a party while in government. But now they got to transform into a real political party while in opposition, because protest politics is not selling anymore in Zimbabwe with the stabilization of the economy, and people just get used to it. They've seen so much of protest over the last 12, 14 years. So my perception is that as long as the MDC thinks by protesting and denouncing everything that ZANU-PF does, even failing to give the kind of analysis we have on this panel in terms of the cabinet, just coming up with condemning statements, about the age of people and all this, people tend to dismiss them. They need to get strategists who are going to have in-depth analysis of what is happening on their part, not independent analysts. They should begin to be an opposition party that looks at every policy that ZANU-PF does. And if they are going to criticize, they have to do that with proper research. I think this is the only way for the MDC to transform into a party that will form a government one day. If they continue on the path of protesting and demonizing ZANU-PF and trying to make them appear like devils, they are surely not doing themselves any good, and they are unlikely to end up in power.
Do you agree the MDC cries too much?
No. And I think, with all due respect, I think that's a far too simplistic analysis of what protest politics is about and the origins of protest politics in Zimbabwe. If one looks soberly and with a clear mind and vision at what has happened in the 2000, around which there were all sorts of irregularities, in 2002, and of course in 2008, when we saw an election stolen by violence. It's very difficult to say that the MDC didn't exist as a well-organized party. If they didn't exist as an organized party, they wouldn't have lost so many of their organizers in the violence of 2008. I followed the MDC, and I've seen lots of policy positions which have been generated over time. In order to be a standard, if you want, democratic oppositional party, you need to be given the space to operate as a party. And it's very clear, if you look at the record of arrests, the way in which laws have been targeting civil society and MDC MPs, members, ordinary voters, it's very clear, the track record is very clear of this government over the last 12 years, that the MDC has not been given the space to operate like a normal party. It's spent half of its time trying to keep its head above water and keep its people safe. Anybody who's lived in Zimbabwe over these last 12 years knows that.
But if this has been the case for the last 13 years and they know this, how can they go around this? Because it will continue.
This is a big problem. How does one operate as a democratic party committed to nonviolence in an atmosphere which is heavily mediated by violence and the unilateral control of the state agencies of violence by one party? How does one operate? And I suppose the position of the MDC was that you would rely upon the big brother protectors in the region of SADC and the AU to guarantee a relatively free and fair level playing field. And as we've recently seen, that protection only goes so far. So this has been the conundrum. If the MDC cannot protect itself within Zimbabwe because of the heavily militarized, if you want, structure of politics and the way in which politics get practiced, who will protect them and protect the democratic process, not just the MDC, but the process, the procedures of democracy? And I think that's the big riddle for the coming 5 years in advance of the next election. So we don't have an election like one.
I would like to come in and say, when you look at
is this Reason?
Yes, it is. I was going to say, when you look at the element of violence, even the MDC, they came to a point where publicly saying you take off the element of violence, and that's the only tool and intimidation that ZANU-PF is using to win elections. Not justifying anything that ZANU-PF does, but that is also a very simplistic way, because in this election, violence was eliminated. But what you then see is ZANU-PF going with a manifesto. You can call it populist, but they have a better strategies of reaching out to the people. I have listened, I have attended to MDC rallies. people get overexcited by the shortcomings of the other side. That's exciting in a stadium, but it's not long lasting. This is my point. And some people have actually been bold enough to say mediocrity in terms of policy depth. And unless these matters are addressed to transform, I was in student politics for many years. As a movement, you can generate a lot of political energy and just go out there and make as much noise about human rights and things like that. But you would need still people that can strategize. That was really my point. And I would like to say, yes, there has been a lot of lack of democratic space, not only in Zimbabwe, not only for the MDC. It's just like ZANU-PF with Ian Smith. That tradition still continues in Africa. It's going to be worse in South Africa. Look at the ANC and people coming out of it. Just see how they're going to close the space as those organizations grow. It's the tradition of Africa. But what you want to do is, under those prevailing circumstances, what are the strategies that you can do to try to come up to a position where you can attain power? And this is what the MDC should be thinking about, as opposed to painting their enemies. They've done it, and it has not helped.
Okay, so let me hear from Rashweat. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, my thoughts, Violet, are that we cannot, of course, deny the fact that the violence, intimidation, that the state apparatus has been abused in the past by ZANU-PF, and they abused even in this election. That is the role of the Registrar General's Office, the chaotic voter registration processes, and all other issues that impinge on the conduct of a free and fair election. But I'll still come back to the point that it is not in the interest of ZANU-PF to create a level playing field, and it is in the interest of the MDC to ensure that that level playing field is created. So it is up to the MDC to organize and to ensure that it has the people behind it to win an election. They did it in 2008, and they need to go back and ask themselves how they did it, and which is different from now. And slowly, I think we are going to into a situation where the citizens of Zimbabwe are looking at politics very much from a materialistic point of view. It's no longer about your ideals on democracy and whatever. I talked to a number of young people and I asked them, why did you not vote? Why did you vote?
Oh, and hello, Rashweat. I think we've lost Rashweat. So a very final word, Reason, just 30 seconds.
Yes, I just agree with what Rashweat was saying, and thank you, Violet. But I think his point is very clear that we are going to politics of the stomach, material things, benefits, which is really matters of policy. What do we get from you? What are you going to do for us? As opposed to liberal democracy values like all these freedoms. They are all good, freedom, and they had their clout. But I think people know that they are not going to eat freedom of speech. They are not going to eat these liberties, important as they are. And it is a time where people are focusing on, okay, what are we going to get out of what we have in Zimbabwe? And it is a shift, a political shift that I believe the MDC should seriously look at.
Okay, and final word, Richard?
I think it's problematic to counterpose liberal rights, human rights which are in a constitution, to the rights of patronage and what can be delivered by a party. I think Zimbabweans want both. I think ZANU has tried to say that there's a difference to have one or the other, but I think most Zimbabweans probably want both.
Okay, and we've come to the end of our program on First Talk. I'd like to thank my panelists, Professor Richard Suanders from York University in Canada, and in Australia we had political writer Reason Wafawarova, and in Harare we heard from Rashweat Mukundu, who is with the Zimbabwe Democracy Institute. Thank you for watching First Talk with Violet Gonda.